In Soviet Russia, mountain climb you. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lunch. Dear viewer, if you are watching this video, I am dead. Just kidding, but this is part 2, and part 1 contains a lot of important context, so if you haven't seen that yet, I would recommend going back and watching part 1, because it's going to explain how we got to where we are right now in this video. The avalanche theory is pretty central to the whole Dyatlov Pass issue since 2020. Before 2020, there was still a general official mystery here. Nobody had come up with a solid explanation, or at the very least, nobody had made an official declaration that, yes, this is in fact what happened here. Basically, for 6 decades, from 1959 until 2020, the official explanation was, and I quote, "overwhelming force which the hikers were not able to overcome." All of that would change when in 2018, the Russian government opened up a new investigation into the Dyatlov Pass incident. The stated goal of the investigation was to leave only one of the 75 theories regarding what happened that night standing, but at the same time, they were only actually looking at natural phenomena there, so they weren't considering things like military tests, UFOs, Bigfoot, all of the other things that have kind of been suggested by the more paranormally inclined, more superstitious side of the internet. While it's definitely understandable that an official investigation by a government, at least the public-facing side, would not involve aliens or Bigfoot, what's interesting is that they did entirely leave out, they did not consider criminal outcomes, criminal explanations. So somebody coming along this group and causing harm to them, a group of prisoners was considered back in 1959, but that was debunked during the 1959 investigation. So yes, it makes sense that an official government investigation would ignore some of the more paranormal stuff, but the fact that they completely discounted any human activity, any human cause, is interesting to me. Now, you may have noticed that I'm wearing a different shirt than I was wearing just a few seconds earlier. That's because I'm terrible with organization, but you know what I'm not terrible with? My beautiful head of hair. You don't get Bigfoot's daughter to go to a nice pasta dinner with you and then ruin it by sobbing into your pasta primavera if you look like George Costanza. And that's why I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, MD Hair. MD Hair is a wonderful hair care system. A lot of people think of hair care in a kind of nebulous way. You're looking for shinier hair, or less oily hair, or to prevent hair loss. MD Hair sees the truth about all of this, which is that these are all the same problem. So rather than just treat hair with one specific goal in mind, they're looking at it as, let's make the whole head healthier. That means a customized topical scalp care solution, customized shampoo and conditioner for the shaft of your hair, supplements to help from the inside, and marine collagen peptides to give you that last little bit of oomph. And if you're a guy like me, you're probably worried about losing your hair at some point. And also, if you're a guy like me, you might be 25 and going, that's a long way off. But if we're being realistic here, it's always good to start early and there's no harm in doing it. Part of the way that MD Hair handles this is by giving you a quiz so they can customize a personal solution for you, as well as analyzing your scalp, and according to them, I have stage 2 hair loss. If you're looking to up your dating game with North America's cryptids, customize your hair growth with MD Hair. Use my promo code LORE70 to get your first month of customized hair products for 70% off. And another interesting thing about this is that they sought to figure out if the bodies, not just of Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, who as we know were moved after death for sure, they wanted to figure out if the rest of the bodies were staged. And to me that's intriguing, because why would your official investigation only look at natural phenomena and explicitly discount humans, while also trying to figure out if humans manipulated the bodies after death? And finally, they wanted to explain the non-hypothermia related injuries sustained by most members of the group. As for why they reopened this investigation so many years later, it was 2018, their official reasoning was a little weird. The official reason that the investigation was reopened is that the expedition was under the direction of a state institution and approved by government employees. As such, they of course needed to get answers to how the government could allow something like this to happen. But of course, at this point, we're talking about 59 years between the actual incident itself and the reopened investigation, and we're not talking about something that happened back in the 90s after the Soviet Union fell. It's not like the Russian Federation appeared as a political entity and said, hey, we should maybe go reinvestigate some of those cold cases that the Soviets weren't able to come up with an answer for. But that's not what happened. They waited until 2018, long after the fall of the Soviet Union. All of the temporal weirdness notwithstanding, the lead prosecutor on the case, Andrei Kuryakov, said the following: "Until we reach a conclusion, such circumstances could be repeated. If we say what happened, it will be possible to correct the rules of behavior on such trips." So, it seems that the official reason for the investigation, in simple English, was, we just want to make sure this doesn't happen again. But again, why wait 60 years for that? Now, of course, there's kind of an answer to this, which is the media. The media, one Russian company in particular, managed to get their hands on Zolotaryov's body. They managed to petition for him to be exhumed so they could re-examine his skeleton. That happened on April 12th, 2018, and there were some interesting results. There had long been a theory that the body they found that was identified as Semyon Zolotaryov was in fact not Semyon Zolotaryov, and that he had never been on the trip, and somebody else entirely was living under his name. In fact, some have suggested that he even disappeared during World War II and never came back. Somebody else had just adopted this persona. And this was partially due to tattoos on his body that his family did not recognize, but Zolotaryov didn't live in the same place as his family. He had not seen them in some time before dying. It's possible also that they just did not see these tattoos on his body before. He might have gotten them during the war or after the war. But in order to dispel this rumor, they decided they would just test his remains for DNA. The problem was, when they did have the DNA tested, it did not match any of Semyon Zolotaryov's living relatives. Those were his niece and nephew, and so of course they're using mitochondrial DNA here. And Alexei Gorokovenko, the geneticist who ran these tests, said that he was certain there was no possible way that Semyon Zolotaryov was the man that they found on that expedition. Whatever corpse they had exhumed, it wasn't his. But of course everybody wanted a second opinion still, and that's when a man named Pavel Ivanov got involved, and while I couldn't find a ton on him in English, from what I understand, this man is a pretty big deal in the Russian genetics field. He determined that that first test was completely wrong, and there was in fact a 99.66% chance that that man was Semyon Zolotaryov, or Semyon Zolotaryov's brother. They could not get any more exact than that due to the nature of the DNA test. The Nikolai angle is interesting because, and I'm going to be honest, I did not do a ton of research into this side, so I can't say for certain if it's true, but it's rumored that Nikolai Zolotaryov decided that he wasn't really vibing with communism and defected to the Germans during the war and disappeared afterwards. Personally, while I understand not vibing with communism, I feel like there were better options than joining the Nazis. So the revelation that the DNA did in fact match, and this was Semyon Zolotaryov, and no one really needed to worry about that angle, that was enough to get people to stop asking questions about that specific conspiracy, but the Dyatlov Pass can of worms had been opened once again, and the Russian media was craving answers. But in August of 2018, a court refused to reopen the case, stating that only the Prosecutor General's office had the right to do so. A month later, in September of 2018, they did just that. And then, in March of 2019, after some months of deliberation and planning, an expedition including government officials, scientists, experts, and various independent researchers all made their way out to the Ural Mountains to head to Dyatlov Pass and determine, are any of us right? And they were looking into a number of possibilities. These included some kind of out there things like UFOs, human enhancement experiments, missile tests, and infrasound. Of course, the government was primarily focused on a few specific theories, including avalanches and katabatic winds. And as far as the expedition, the timing, the people involved, how much can you trust it, it is important to note a couple of things. A, they brought along a lot of people, including some people with pretty wacky ideas. But also, Kuryakov was working on his PhD at the time, and his dissertation just so happened to be about Dyatlov Pass. And then, eventually, on July 11th, 2020, Kuryakov announced to the world that they had their answer. They knew what happened at Dyatlov Pass. It was an avalanche. And of course, if you were to ask, okay, well, walk us through this, how did this work? The answers go a little something like this. To the question of why did they leave the tent, the answer was pretty straightforward. An avalanche. There was a mix of actual material evidence as well as some situational evidence that they were like, all right, well, if you look at this, it hints at this, and if we can tie all of these together, basically exactly what we do at this channel. That included a couple of observations, such as the fact that Thibault and Zolotaryov were by far the best dressed of the group. The way that this is all rationalized by the Russian government is that Thibault was probably the one on duty that night, the one who was supposed to be up looking checking to make sure that they weren't attacked by wild animals, and that there wasn't an avalanche, and that, a Yeti didn't come out of the woods. As for Zolotaryov, his state of being well-dressed is the explanation for it is kind of dependent on the avalanche theory being correct, which was that Zolotaryov was dressed because he felt like an avalanche was possible in this area. It suggested that Zolotaryov would have had this predictive capability due to his time in the military, and that's why he looked around and went, maybe not. Now, of course, if you look at Zolotaryov's military bio, it doesn't look great. He bounces around a lot. It seems like he never really found his footing. He did fight, it seems, but he's not Spetsnaz here. The main reason that Zolotaryov would have had a solid idea that maybe this was not the best place for them to camp would have been the fact that he was in fact a sporting instructor. This was his job. Leading trips like this was what Zolotaryov did for a living. Zolotaryov would have, sensing the avalanche coming, informed everybody. They would have cut their way out of the tent to get out of it faster. According to Kuryakov, all of this is textbook avalanche survival stuff. The very next thing that the group did after leaving the tent was walk about 1.5 kilometers downhill to the tree line. All of the evidence suggests that they did this in a pretty orderly manner. It was not panicked. They were walking single file, straight line. They knew where they were going. Somebody was in command. This was not a panicked rush anywhere. And after their little trek, they ended up at a cedar tree. It was pointed out to me that cedar does not natively grow in this area, and it was probably a fir tree. I'm not sure why it's referred to as cedar. Maybe there was, for some reason, one lone cedar out there. But the point is, this tree gets referred to throughout the documentation as the cedar. But the next question that the media asked of Kuryakov at the press conference was, well, what happened at the cedar? It appears that the first thing they attempted to do was build a fire, and they succeeded at doing this for about 90 minutes as far as the burned logs suggest. But 90 minutes in, either the fire died or it became clear that it was going to be inadequate. It seems more likely that it died than that they willingly chose to leave a fire. And according to Kuryakov, Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, who were the first two to die, were the ones actively collecting firewood for the group. Now, Kuryakov doesn't say what everybody else was doing, just that Krivonishenko and Doroshenko were actively involved in collecting firewood, that as a result of this, they became exhausted and they were unable to make it. And the reason that they climbed 5 meters up into that tree was that the lower branches will be covered with frost and moss and just wouldn't be usable for a fire. At this point then, the remaining hikers divided up the gear from Krivonishenko and Doroshenko's bodies, got as warm as they could, and then split up into 2 groups. And then you get the question, how did the rest of them die? Well, according to Kuryakov, Slobodin, Dyatlov, and Kolmogorova decided that they were going to try and reach the tent. Unfortunately, they quickly succumbed to the freezing temperatures, collapsed, and passed away. Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibault, and Kolevatov, they all went a different direction. They still went south, but they decided to go towards a ravine and make themselves a little den. They stacked snow around the edges and lined the floor with cedar branches to prevent themselves from sitting directly on the snow so they could preserve a little bit more warmth. And then, with spare clothing, they created seats for themselves so that they would have even more protection from the cold, which suggests to us that at this point, staying off the snow was more important than wearing as many clothes as possible, which tells us they probably weren't completely freezing. Because again, they already had the cedar branches. Putting down clothes on top of that wasn't going to do a ton more aside from give them a little bit of comfort. So it tells us that these guys at this point probably were not in immediate danger of freezing to death, or at least they didn't feel that they were in immediate danger of freezing to death. As for how they died, experts suggested that they fell about 3 meters when their den collapsed, and that the rib fractures and the skull fracture sustained by Thibault were all caused by them collapsing onto rocks below them. And then after that, snow would have fallen on top of them, compounding it. In addition to all of this, just the year prior, the Investigative Committee for the Russian Federation had reviewed all of the evidence from 1959, didn't do any new research of their own, just reviewed the evidence that existed. And what they determined was that all of these people in the tent panicked because of an avalanche, cut their way out, and ran down the hill and succumbed to the elements. And in that version of events, the reason that they all have different varying amounts of clothes on is not because there was a methodical taking of the clothes from the dead and reassigning them to the living, but rather because they were just not all in the correct states of undress. They panicked, they threw on whatever they could, and they got down the hill. So that version would have Krivonischenko and Doroshenko dying because they had the fewest clothes on. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin were in the same situation essentially that they were in Kuryakov's version, which is they tried to make it back up the slope to get more clothes, and they failed to and froze to death. The remaining 4, according to that version, went looking for shelter, constructed their den, and then while trying to find something else maybe, they fell into a ravine and died. So far as the Russian authorities are concerned, at least for their purposes, this answered all of the questions. But we're going to look closer, we're going to review everything they said, and of course we got to ask the question, does this all actually hold up? Both the investigative committee version and the prosecutor general's office version of this story have problems right off the bat. Kuryakov's version has it going down as Zolotaryov organizing an orderly evacuation, but the investigative committee's version has them all panicking and running from the tent. It does seem likely that Kuryakov's version of events is the one that's closer to the truth, simply because the footprints suggest it was an orderly evacuation, and in fact, not a panicked withdrawal. The prints leading from the tent to the cedar show a single file line, with the larger of the men, based on the weight and how it impacted their footprints, being the ones walking in the back, likely so that they could make the most easy to follow prints possible in case they needed to return to the tent. Also, one version of events that I found had the footprints beginning about 40 meters away from the tent, suggesting that whatever happened initially, either they were a little bit more scattered at first, or something covered up those footprints that were closer to the tent. In any case, just a little detail there. Part of where I see a problem with this entire avalanche theory, though, is that nobody on the expedition to search for them reported any signs of an avalanche, nobody reported experiencing an avalanche, and on all of the 100+ expeditions to Dyatlov Pass since, nobody has reported an avalanche, or, again, any signs of an avalanche. Additionally, there is disagreement, to put it lightly, on where particularly the tent actually was when it was found in 1959, because while we do have plenty of photos of the tent, we don't have the exact location of the tent. The tree line has changed since 1959 and moved further up the mountain as it's gotten warmer, so it's really hard, looking at those photos from 1959, to come up with an exact proper location. You really do have to go out there and replicate photos until you get it right. The result is that there's about 115 meters difference between where the government has placed the tent's location and where independent researchers have placed the tent's location. In either case, the tent was below the same ridge, but even the smallest change in geography can have pretty significant impacts on the outcome of testing for something like this. For example, there was a group of engineers who used the same program as Disney for how they modeled the snow effects in Frozen, and the problem is, if you look at that and you assume that they were in one location, well, you have to run the simulation again in a different location to make sure that you're on track. Essentially, you need to check and make sure that just changing location didn't change the outcome. And then there's the issue of what they left the tent wearing versus what they left behind. And of course, the fact that some of them attempted to return to the tent also gives us some clues to what happened and what they experienced when they were up there, because the decisions they made after the cedar tree have implications. When they left the tent, they left behind 9 parkas, 8 quilted jackets, 1 fur jacket, 2 fur sleeveless vests, 4 pairs of shell pants, 1 pair of cotton pants, 4 scarves, 13 pairs of gloves, 8 pairs of ski boots, 7 pairs of boots, 2 pairs of slippers, 8 pairs of gaiters, 3 caps, 1 fur hat, 2 felt berets, 3 compasses, 1 pocket watch, 3 Finnish-style knives. Those belonging to Thibodeau and Krivonischenko were in their parkas, whereas the one belonging to Kolevatov was recorded as being in its sheath. 3 axes, 19 overboots, 2 buckets, 2 pots, 2 flasks, 1 first aid kit. And then there's an assortment of socks and toiletries. Excluding Thibaut, who was probably on watch at the time all of this went down, and Zolotaryov, who inexplicably was fully dressed, nobody who left the tent that night, which is all of them of course, had proper footwear. Dyatlov, Krivonischenko, Doroshenko, Dubinina, Kolevatov, and Kolmogorova all lacked shoes entirely. Zolotaryov had a pair of handmade but warm leather shoes called burka. Slobodin had 1 felt boot and Thibaut had 2. And you might be thinking, felt boots, really, that's it. We're not talking about just a little piece of craft felt. These are heavy Russian felt boots. They're called valanche, and they are perfectly suited to this kind of traveling over dry snow. Looking at what they were wearing can also tell us how much time they had to get ready. I wanted to get an idea of how much time they had to prepare for their little outing, which required establishing a baseline for what everybody was wearing when they left the tent in the first place. And it appears that every member of the group left the tent wearing, at the very least, underwear, undershirt, a pair of socks, long underwear or sweatpants, an overshirt, and a sweater or light jacket. The group likely focused from that point, if they had any time to prepare at all, on putting on light jackets and socks, because you can't put a light jacket on over a heavy jacket and you can't put a sock on over a boot. With that covered, we need to divert to the cedar for a moment, because we can't really discuss what was going on with the whole avalanche theory until we understand the circumstances that led to them trying to go back there. Kuryakov argues that the group left the tent and immediately made for the tree line to get out of the open so they would have shelter from the wind. So they walked from the tent to the tree line, and I want to reiterate what that means. He is suggesting that they walked 1.5 kilometers from their tent to the tree line for the purpose of getting out of the wind, and then proceeded to go no further into the forest because they were tired. Forget that being in the trees, even another 10 to 20 meters would have provided them with considerably more protection from the wind, as well as a lot more wood with which to make a fire. Nope, they were just too tired to walk another 30 feet, sat down, and then decided to climb a tree. So I don't think that that was their reason for not going further in. Again, considering the fact that Krivonishenko and Doroshenko then proceeded to climb a tree, but Kuryakov also says they were the first to die because they were tired. I think they didn't go further into the forest for a completely different reason. I think they didn't want to lose sight of the tent. Now, if the tent had been completely buried by an avalanche, I don't think it would matter if they lost sight of the tent, aside from, maybe figuring out their exact position. But figuring out their exact position would probably not involve them climbing the tree at night, because they should have been focused on surviving at that point. So, I think that they intended to get back to the tent before the night ended. Or at the very least, the situation was so dire at the cedar that they felt they were better off expending energy climbing a tree. Again, 5 meters into a tree. That was a better use of their energy than trying to make a fire. It also was very odd to me, the suggestion that they climbed up into a living tree to cut branches to make fire, because they couldn't find anything on the ground that was going to be good for making a fire, when anything they found on the ground would have been drier on the inside than a thing they just cut directly off of a tree. Some of the worst wood you can possibly use for starting a fire, especially in a survival situation, is green wood. But anyway, Kuryakov's version of events has it that Krivonishenko and Doroshenko are the ones primarily gathering wood for the group. They become exhausted, they die at the cedar. Now, first of all, why would they be the only ones collecting wood? That makes no sense. But anyway, after Krivonishenko and Doroshenko died for the reason of being cold and tired, after that point, everybody else divided up their clothes and started a new plan of action. Now, before we get to that new plan of action, I want to mention some stuff about Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, which is that I don't believe for a second that they were the only people gathering wood, because again, that makes no sense whatsoever. Nobody was injured yet. So I see no reason to believe that Doroshenko and Krivonishenko were the only people gathering wood, but they are the only people who have injuries consistent with falling out of a tree, which means that they were likely the only people who climbed the tree. And like I said, it's very likely that the rest of the members of the group were also actively looking for wood, so Kuryakov's theory here essentially boils down to Doroshenko and Krivonishenko climbed the tree looking for wood, and became too tired and died. Never mind all of the random bruises that really seem like they fell out of a tree that had nothing to do with it. So that you understand this, the full list of their injuries is as follows. Doroshenko reportedly had burned hair on the right side of his head, blood all over his ears, nose, and eyes, swollen upper lip with dark red hemorrhage, gray foam/liquid coming from his open mouth attributed to pulmonary edema, and pulmonary edema is when there's an abnormal buildup of fluid in the lungs. He had discolored ears, abrasions to the inner shoulder on the right side, as well as 2 cuts without bleeding into the tissue underneath, brown-red bruising on the upper right forearm, swelling and abrasions on the back of the right hand, severe bruising of the tissue surrounding the second metacarpal bone on the right hand, all fingers and toes severely frostbitten, brown-red abrasion on the inner left shoulder, brown-red abrasion on the inner left elbow, surface skin wound on the inner left forearm covered in dried blood, and similar bruises to both shins. Krivonishenko, who was found lying right next to Doroshenko, as we know, had bruises on the forehead, bleeding in the right temporal occipital region due to a damaged temporalis muscle, bruised left temporal bone, tip of his nose was missing, likely a post-mortem scavenging incident. He had frostbitten ears. A portion of his own skin from his right hand was found in his mouth. The back of his right hand was swollen, the fingers brown-purple, with the soft tissue around his knuckles a whitish gray. His right hand fingertips were dark brown with minor abrasions to the soft tissue. Right palm was bluish red in color, dark brown skin wound with jagged edges at the base of the thumb. The fourth and fifth fingers of the right hand had a cutaneous wound with hard edges and a charred surface. There was a 2-centimeter scalpel wound to the rear area of his left hand, and yes, that is from the autopsy, but again, the autopsy was translated from Russian, so scalpel wound might not be the best terminology there. Or it could be that the medical examiner looked at it and said, that's a scalpel wound, but also he doesn't come to the conclusion that this was foul play. Then again, he's a medical examiner. That's not necessarily his job. He had a pale red abrasion along the right side of his chest, pale red abrasions along the middle clavicular line at the edge of his ribs, a dark red abrasion on his left wrist, back of the left hand was swollen. He had pink and brown bruise on his left buttock. He had 3 linear lacerations with even edges and a depth of 0.3 centimeters, 1.5 centimeters by 0.4 centimeters in length and width. And yeah, we're just gonna breeze past what sound like claw marks because I couldn't find any reason that those would possibly be there, aside from the obvious, but the obvious doesn't make any sense either because there's no evidence that there was an animal there. He also had 3 cutaneous lacerations on the upper thigh, dark brown abrasion on the front right femur and tibia, a dark brown abrasion on the front inner left thigh, swelling in the left thigh and foot, 31 centimeters by 10 centimeters burn all across his left leg, dark brown abrasions on the right shin, and patches of peeling red-brown epidermal tissue on the back of his left foot, with his second toe charred to brown and dense to the touch. You have no idea how much thinking I did this week.
Yo, I bet.
So, while the 2 men absolutely did die of hypothermia, there's a laundry list of injuries that are not accounted for by Kuryakov's model. Kuryakov is likely correct about one specific thing. Krivonischenko and Doroshenko were most likely the only members of the group to climb the tree. I say that because there are injuries specific to this pair. Only Doroshenko and Krivonischenko have injuries consistent with climbing into and falling out of a tree. They were both covered in bruises to an extent far beyond anybody else in the group, and many of those bruises were long and narrow, like branches. There are, of course, members of the group that made it to the den who have injuries that could be consistent with falling from a high height out of a tree, but if they had sustained them at the cedar, they never would have made it to the den. They would have died. And both men had damage to their torsos consistent with falling between branches. The question then becomes not how did they die, but why did they and they alone fall out of the tree? We can't assume with certainty that they were the only ones to climb the tree. This is because they only have injuries associated with falling, not climbing. However, we also can't assume that everyone climbed the tree. I say that because there's a number of theories here that involve the idea that everybody climbed the tree, and the reasoning there is that they were trying to escape something on the ground. Absent any evidence that everybody climbed the tree, it seems most likely that those 2 did it, and that they did it for the purpose of getting a better view. In any case, this appears to have been a game-changing moment. A lot of sources suggest the reason for the various states of undress was paradoxical undressing, something that occurs as the body goes into hypothermia, where you start to feel very, very warm as your body is desperately trying to keep you alive in your last moments. So, a lot of people who are found dead of hypothermia will have stripped off various items of clothing. We've actually talked about this on a few occasions in relation to the missing 411 phenomenon, but that's not what happened here. This was deliberate. They took the clothes off of the dead bodies of Krivonischenko and Doroshenko so that they themselves had a better chance of surviving. They were not all hypothermic at this point, just those 2. From there, it's unclear what happened regarding that course of action, because one group headed for the tent and the other group did not head for the tent. The group split in 2, and it's not totally clear to anybody why, because again, we don't have any journal entries, there's no video, no audio. We can just go based off of what 9 people left in their midst as they died. Additionally, part of the reason we know that they split and not that they all went up to the tent together, lost 3 members of the group, and decided to descend was due to the state of Kolmogorova, Dyatlov, and Slobodin. There are also some factors that we'll get to later in the video that tie into this, but right now I just want to point out the clothing. Had all 7 of the remaining members of the group attempted to reach the tent together, they probably would have stripped the bodies as people fell, but they didn't do that, which means that Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova probably were the only 3 to make for the tent. So in that case, why did they split, and could it have had to do with what caused them to leave the tent? Something caused them to abandon the tent quickly enough to forego boots, gloves, and heavy jackets. So whatever they were worried about, the danger must have been fairly immediate. On the other hand, it has to have been something that was less dangerous than remaining out in the cold without the proper clothing, or something that was only temporarily dangerous. They also may have initially intended to go for their storage cache where they had additional gear, sleeping bags, tools, food. But it's possible that in the darkness with whatever was going on around them, they simply got disoriented or confused and went north instead of south. In both cases, they would be going downhill. In fact, it's possible that when Krivonishenko and Doroshenko got up into that tree, they weren't even looking for the tent. They may have been looking for the storage cache. They may not have realized that they were in the wrong place yet. So splitting up may have been a disagreement, but splitting up might have also been a division of labor issue. They might have had one group go to the tent to try and get more clothes, blankets, some survival gear, some tools, some food, while the other group constructed a shelter further below. So to understand what happened here further, because again, we have very little evidence on its face to look at, we have to look at the injuries to the Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin group. Igor Dyatlov was found on his back, his head facing towards the tent, with his arms across his chest like this, almost looking as if he was yelling. And he had the following injuries: minor abrasions to the forehead, minor abrasions to the upper eyelid, brown-red abrasions to the left eyebrow, minor abrasions to the left cheek, brown-red abrasions on both cheeks, dried blood on the lips, lower jaw was missing an incisor, but it appeared to be an older injury or something that was extracted years prior, bruises on his knees, surface level only, reddish-brown abrasions on both ankles with bleeding into the underlying tissue, one laceration near those scratches, and one graze toward the lower tibia, lots of small scratches on the lower third of the right forearm and on the palm, purple-gray discoloration of the back of the right hand, bruised knuckles consistent with fist fighting, brown-purple left hand with brownish-red bruising, yes, keep in mind that I mentioned fist fighting, superficial wounds to the 2nd and 5th fingers on the left hand, and irregular linear skin wound on the palm surface of the 2nd and 5th fingers on the left hand, 0.1 to 0.2 centimeters deep. The next person they found, of course, was Kolmogorova, who was found on her right side with the following injuries: dark red abrasion to the forehead, right side, pale gray skin above the right eyebrow, dark red abrasion to the upper eyelids, brown-red graze on the bridge and tip of the nose, numerous abrasions on the right cheekbone, bruised skin on the right side of the face, bruised knuckles, jagged edged wound with missing skin to the back of the right hand, base of the 3rd finger, frostbitten fingertips, and a 26 by 6 centimeter, that's 10 inch by 2.3 inch, long bright red abrasion on the lower back and left side. And finally, Slobodin was face down with one arm flung out to the side and the other balled in front of him, as though he'd been running mid-stride when he froze. Of course, he was also face down in the snow. And he was found with hemorrhages in both temples, minor abrasions on the forehead, 2 1.5 centimeter long scratches 0.3 centimeters apart on his forehead, brownish red bruises on the upper eyelid of his left eye with hemorrhaging into the underlying tissue, traces of blood in his nose, swelling and small abrasions to both sides of the face, bruised knuckles again, brown bruises on the left forearm and palm, again interesting, that's another matching injury, swollen lips, bruises on the left tibia, epidermis torn from the right forearm, and of course it is perfectly valid to ask the question, how did that occur while he was fully clothed without tearing through the clothes as well? And finally, he had a 6 centimeter fracture to the frontal bone of the skull. Looking at all of that, some oddities become apparent rather quickly. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, and Krivonishenko all had bruised knuckles. And Doroshenko had pretty bad bruising to his right hand on the knuckle as well. None of the 4 at the den had bruised knuckles. All 5 of them had bruised knuckles. While it's not certain that those would have come from a fist fight, it is a little weird to have that many people with bruises all over their faces and torsos, as well as bruised knuckles. And when I say that it wasn't just the bruised knuckles, that's because Dyatlov had bruised knuckles as well as abrasions to the forehead, the upper eyelid, the left eyebrow, and both cheeks. Kolmogorova had bruised knuckles, abrasions to the right forehead, upper eyelids, nose, left shoulder, right cheek, and a long bruised area on her back and side, as well as a jagged flesh wound on the right hand's backside. Slobodin, of course, had bruised knuckles, many abrasions on the face, a bloody nose, abrasions on the forehead, and swollen lips, while Krivonyshenko had bruised knuckles, but then again he also fell out of a tree, and Doroshenko had a single bruised knuckle. So Kolmogorova, Slobodin, and Dyatlov definitely have a lot of injuries consistent with a fistfight. Krivonyshenko and Doroshenko, it's a little iffy. And then there's the irregular linear skin wound on Dyatlov's 2nd and 5th fingers. To me, that does sound a little bit like he went and used his hand to block a knife or a sharpened branch. And talking about the knives brings up another issue. As far as the entire process goes, there had to have been knives at the cedar and at the den, but 3 knives were found in the tent in parkas and sheaths, and then a pocket knife was found in Dyatlov's parka back at the tent. No other knives were found, and as far as determining who actually had knives, it seems like it's possible that nobody else had knives. Certainly none of the other bodies had knives on them. Further weirdness includes the odd wound on Slobodin's right forearm. 2 patches of skin were missing, measuring 2.5 by 3 centimeters and 3 by 1 centimeters. And that could be explicable if not for the fact that the wound was on his forearm, but none of the clothes over the wound were torn. So that means it wasn't scavenging. He obtained that wound while he was alive, possibly before even getting dressed. But as we said, it seems like everybody in the group was sleeping in a certain amount of clothing, which would likely have included longer sleeves. Additionally, Dyatlov's position doesn't make sense. He died of hypothermia, and yet he had an unbuttoned jacket with no signs of paradoxical undressing otherwise. And he also died in an active position, his hands across his chest as if he was trying to rip something off. And then there's Slobodin's head wound, which is not explained. The autopsy suggests that the head wound was a result of falling onto rock or ice, but Slobodin fell onto deep snow, and there's no evidence that he fell out of a tree. The wound was also too severe to have been caused by a fist or a knee. Either he was struck with a heavy stick or rock, or struck himself with a heavy stick or rock, but around his body, there were no heavy sticks or rocks with which to strike himself. So that kind of implies that either he started this trek with a head wound from tripping, or that he didn't have the head wound when he started the trek back up to the tent. And as stated, the autopsy suggests a fall, but simply says a blunt object was responsible for it. In the same vein, the long bruise along Kolmogorova's back and side is not explained by simply falling into the snow, and she also has no other injuries consistent with falling out of a tree. And many have pointed out that Kolmogorova's bruise appears like one that might have been caused by a baton being pressed against her, as if during an interrogation. And then there's some more weirdness. Both Kolmogorova and Slobodin showed signs of being moved after their deaths, but Dyatlov didn't. This is a problem because Dyatlov was the first to die, and he's the only one that doesn't show signs of being moved. Slobodin would have died between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova, but Kolmogorova would not have stopped to reposition his body without taking any of his clothes for herself, and there was no one to reposition Kolmogorova. Now, in the interest of being fair and presenting all of the evidence, the reason that it was suggested that they were moved after death was that the livor mortis spots, basically the blood pooling in their body after death, was not in the correct position for where it should have been had they died in the position they were found. For example, Slobodin had livor mortis spots on his back, but if he died in the position he was found on his face, then he should not have had them on his back. They should have been on his front. I will also be transparent about the fact that when it comes to the medical stuff, I am kind of relying on what the medical people said, because I don't know what most of this means. But with all of those people dead on their way up to the tent, it brings us to yet another question. Why did they go for the tent? One possibility is that it had in fact been an avalanche, which meant that the danger had passed, and if they could reach the tent, they had a good chance of survival. But if it had been an avalanche, why would they go back for something that could very easily be completely covered in snow? And if something other than an avalanche had driven them from the tent, what could that be? A fire has been suggested, considering that they did have the portable camping stove, but nothing was burned inside of the tent. But whatever had driven them from the tent, they must have believed they had a better chance of surviving an encounter with that than they did just staying out in the open by the cedar, or, assuming they had a conversation with the others, crafting a den. Alternatively, they might not have had a choice because they may have been attacked by something at the cedar. And some of the evidence and the argument for the avalanche theory does stem from the very existence of that second group at the den. The den group had chosen not to go for the tent, instead walking about 50 meters south of the cedar, where they dug out some snow, put some cedar branches, and constructed a little shelter for themselves. If it had been an avalanche, there was very little chance of recovering anything useful from the tent, and there was the consideration that they would have to make the trek back down as well, which, even if they survived getting up to the tent, they might not survive getting back down from the tent. And the futility of such an attempt to reach the tent is also supported by the fact that the best dressed of the group, Thibaut and Zolotaryov, decided they were not shooting for the tent. They were not going along for that. They did not need to. They were safer down there. And that could be because they had the most clothes and simply decided, I'm risking my life more going to the tent. And in their case, what was going to the tent going to achieve for them? They might get some food, but they also might die on their way there. And then, of course, it could simply be that all of them decided they stood to gain too little and it wasn't worth the risk. Group 2 also answers a few questions while creating some of its own. They did return to the cedar a number of times to collect branches from it, which tells us that they probably weren't attacked by something there. Additionally, Dubinina was wearing Krivonashenko's sweater, which tells us that they were all at the cedar together and that they did, in fact, strip the dead for their clothes. The fact that they even decided to build a shelter tells us that they were still in a stable state of mind, and had the group died of hypothermia, it would basically be case closed here, but that's not what happened. 3 of the 4 members of the den group had a cause of death other than hypothermia, with Kolevatov being the odd man out. Dubinina was the first of that group to be found on May 5th, 1959, and in her position she was kind of kneeling over a natural rock ledge. Her injuries were as follows. The soft tissue around her eyes, eyebrows, and nose bridge were missing, and a portion of her left cheekbone was exposed. The tissue around her left temporal bone was damaged, her eye sockets were empty, her eyeballs completely missing. Her nose was not broken, but the cartilage was. The soft tissue of the upper lip was missing, the teeth and upper jaw were exposed. Her tongue was also missing. Ribs 2, 3, 4, and 5 were broken on the right side. Ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 were broken on the left side. There was a massive hemorrhage into the heart's right atrium, and she had a bruise on the middle of her left thigh. Her cause of death was listed as massive hemorrhage into her heart, multiple rib fractures, and internal bleeding, and this was the result of an impact of great force to her chest. One of the sweaters she was wearing was radioactive, and it also belonged to Krivonashenko. And as we mentioned in the previous video, they were all found in a stream in a ravine. Thibaut was found face down in that ravine. Kolmogorova, it seems, was directly below him on the ledge. Thibaut was also best dressed of the group and had the fewest injuries of anyone involved. And yet, compared to most members of the group, he died very violently. He had multiple fractures to the temporal bone on the right side of his skull, radiating about 40 to 45 millimeters from a central impact point, with one fracture line extending all the way down the forehead. There was a tissue defect in the cheek of irregular shape, and a hemorrhage in the right shoulder. His cause of death was trauma to the brain caused by whatever caused the trauma to his skull. The autopsy suggests it's the result of a fall, and though he may not have died immediately, he was likely unconscious for the remainder of his life. The exact wording from the autopsy is that the injuries were caused by a great force with the subsequent falling, hurling, and concussion of Thibaut. The remaining one to have traumatic injury was Zolotaryov, and he was found in the arms of Kolevatov, who was behind him and above him in the ravine. His eyeballs were missing, the soft tissue was missing from his left eyebrow area, there was a soft tissue defect in the right temporal area, and he had a flail chest with ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 broken on the right side. Finally, Kolevatov, as I mentioned, seemed to be holding Zolotaryov as if to keep him warm or protect him from something. He was missing tissue from around his eyes, his eyebrows were completely missing, and his skull was exposed. His nose also was not broken, but the cartilage was. There was a tissue defect in the cheek with the jawbone exposed, a tissue defect behind the ear, deformed but not broken neck, diffuse bleeding into the soft tissue of the left knee, bath skin on the hands and feet, so basically his hands and feet had been soaking for a while, and overall his skin was reportedly a grayish-green color with a purple tinge. His cause of death is listed as hypothermia, with all of those other injuries being post-mortem. With this group, there are a few things to address that are often presented as being very mysterious that aren't really as mysterious as they seem to be. For example, Kolevatov's sweater and pants, as well as the sweater being worn by Dubinina that belonged to Krivonishenko, were all radioactive. It was very mildly radioactive, and both Kolevatov and Krivonishenko worked with radioactive materials in their daily lives. However, the radiologists working on the case determined that the levels of radiation were above those that would be typical for people who just work with these materials day to day. They therefore concluded that this contamination occurred due to dust in the air, radioactive dust, not their working with plutonium. It should be mentioned that if you look at the actual readings of what the levels of radiation were, you're going to see a more mild amount than was likely present when they died, simply because they were sitting in running water for a long period of time, which meant that the radioactive material was constantly being rinsed away from their clothes, so they probably had more radioactive material on their clothing when they passed away. Is that relevant to how they died? Not necessarily. Most of the group was also missing soft tissue. Dubinina was missing her eyes and tongue, Zolotaryov his eyes, and Kolevatov, as well as the aforementioned, were both missing tissue from around the eyes and brow areas. Now you may be thinking, isn't skin falling off also a bit of a symptom of radiation poisoning? Yes, but they did not have enough radiation to be suffering the effects of acute radiation poisoning. But all 4 den members also had bath skin and tissue defects, while the rest of the group had no such injuries. This, of course, is explicable because those are the only 4 that were found in running water. Everybody else was further up the mountain or closer to the tree line and frozen. It was likely the running water that caused a lot of these tissue defects and missing tissues, as well as there being the possibility of animal scavenging for things like the eyes and the tongue. What's a little bit harder to explain is the group's major injuries as well as their decision-making. First of all, after separating from Dyatlov's group, for whatever reason they did so, they left the tree line to build the den. This could be because they felt that digging out a shelter was going to be easier than constructing one, but we can't know for sure. The problem here is that no tools were discovered by the cedar or by the den, and they must have used knives to cut the branches. But like we said, the knives are kind of an issue. When the tent was discovered at the end of February, all of the finished knives, those owned by Kolevatov, Tibo, and Krivonishenko, one of the 2 Shenkos, those ones were all reportedly in the tent in February. The only other knife found was Dyatlov's pocket knife, which was also in the tent. So, how could they have cut the branches without any knives? Moving on to another weird thing, while radioactive dust would explain why Krivonishenko and Kolevatov had radioactive clothing, it does not explain why nobody else in the group had radioactive clothing. It is possible that they could have all passed through an area with radioactive dust and only Kolevatov and Krivonishenko actually accrued any, but that's also extremely unlikely. It's also possible that they acquired the radiation at the den and that it was never on Krivonishenko, it was only on Dubinina wearing Krivonishenko's stuff, but then that doesn't explain the absence of radioactive material from either Zolotaryov or Tibo. There's also the fact that they made a den at all. If the tent was accessible, why not send the best-dressed members up there? Could be that the best-dressed members refused to go, but up to this point, they'd shown pretty good cohesion as a team, and it seems unlikely that people would have just started saying no out of the blue at a time like this. And then there's the other possibility, that the tent wasn't accessible, but if the tent wasn't accessible, why send 3 people up there in the first place? The choice to both send people to the tent as well as build a den implies that either there was disagreement in the group between Dyatlov's crew and Zolotaryov's crew, or that the tent was accessible but too damaged to be usable, so sending one group up to get supplies while the other constructed a shelter was the best plan. Thing is, that doesn't sound like the result of an avalanche, but it also doesn't sound like the result of a terrifying monster. Whatever drove them from the tent, they left rapidly, in an organized manner, and seemingly with the intent to return. However, they also went the wrong direction, and so they were either blocked from going south to their storage cache, were confused about which direction they were going, or inexplicably chose not to look for the storage cache. And most curious of all are the injuries here. Dubinina had a crushed chest, Thibault had a major skull fracture, and the entire right side of Zolotaryov's ribs were broken. When Vozrozdinye, the medical examiner who was in charge of conducting all of these autopsies, was interviewed, he did have answers to questions about these. Regarding Thibault, he said that his injuries were the result of throwing, fall, or jettisoning of the body, and he did not believe that those injuries could simply be caused by Thibault falling from his own height, just falling over. Essentially, it wasn't that Thibault just slipped, rolled his ankle, and hit his head on a rock. He fell several meters. In fact, he compares the injury to being hit by a car at high speed. He essentially says that Thibault either fell or was thrown off of a ledge and then hit his head on the rock or ice below. He also was asked if it was possible that someone simply just hit Thibault in the head with a rock, but he said no. And when asked how long Thibault might have survived, he said that it was possible he lived 2 to 3 more hours, but he would have been unconscious and basically impossible to move. He was also asked what could have caused the injuries to Dubinina and Zolotaryov, and if they could have been the same cause. He did not directly answer the second question, but he did answer the first question. He notes that the injuries were similar. We're dealing with hemorrhaging into the cardiac muscle and pleural cavity as a result of blunt force trauma and subsequent fracture of the ribs. And while Zolotaryov may have lived a little while, hour or so, Dubinina was likely dead 10 to 20 minutes after her injury. It does seem he was not asked about Kolevatov, which poses a problem for Kuryakov's version of events. Because Kuryakov was claiming that the entire den group died together of the same general cause. So first, let's kind of describe the den we're dealing with here. When found, it sat at a depth of 3.5 meters beneath the top of the snow, and it was discovered after Monsey hunters came across a set of Dubinina's clothing, as well as what appeared to be a trail of fir branches leading directly into a snowbank. It was built 50 meters from the cedar and about 6 meters from a ravine. The den itself consisted of 14 fir branches laid out in about a 3 square meter area, with piles of clothes set up as seats on the edges. And of course, the clothes and the branches were there and organized in a manner to make sure that they were getting as much distance between them and the snow as possible. And I will say, looking at images of it, it's decidedly small for 7 people, which would lend to the theory that they were having a disagreement and they did not expect Dyatlov and his people to come back, but it could also be that they simply didn't have enough materials and planned to cuddle anyway. Additionally, 15 meters from the den were found a spoon and a knife sheath, but no knife. It should also be mentioned that the exact location of the den is not known for certain, because once again, nobody recorded any specific coordinates, so I can give you the general meters between things, but I can't tell you precisely where everything was. And according to Kuryakov's version of events, the 4 remaining hikers sitting in their den fell down at least 2 meters into a ravine 6 meters away from them. So, and I mean this, he says that the den collapsed and they fell 2 meters. 6 meters away. So it's like they glitched. Like they both fell down and sideways at the same time. And the den is, to be clear, to confirm this, according to the people who found it, a depth of 2.5 to 3 meters beneath the surface of the snow, 6 meters from the bodies, which themselves were at a depth of 2 to 2.5 meters. This means that the difference between the level of the den and the level at which the bodies were found was no more than 3 feet. A 0.5 meter to 1 meter fall, even if it were directly onto rocks, would not cause the sort of injuries that we see with Zolotaryov and Dubinina, and it certainly would not prevent Kolevatov from getting up. So, with all of that info now presented, let's go re-examine the official story. According to the Russians, someone spotted an avalanche, the entire group left the tent with such urgency that they didn't put boots on, and also sliced the tent open to escape, hiked 1.5 kilometers in the wrong direction, despite being of sound mind enough to walk single file downhill, built a fire but only had 2 people help collect firewood for it, and climb the tree. Those 2 died, so the group split. One group made for the now totally snow-covered tent 1.5 kilometers uphill in high winds and impossibly cold temperatures, and died of exposure. The other group built a den and then died by falling 6 meters horizontally and then 1 meter down. All of this was done with disappearing knives. Now, personally, I don't love that story, so let's dig into the theories. Our first theory. Leaving the tent was the result of an imminent avalanche. There were no signs of an avalanche. Avalanches are rare in that area. They tried to go back, they left going the wrong way, and they knew better than to camp where an avalanche was likely to occur. For so many reasons, I don't like the avalanche theory, not least of which is the fact that a lot of people who hear about the avalanche theory think it explains how they died, not just why they left the tent. It literally only explains why they left the tent, and then you could kind of extrapolate that, well, it explains how they died because they died of hypothermia, except for the ones that didn't die of hypothermia and all of the many injuries they had that were not consistent with dying of hypothermia. Now again, I'm not going to argue that what eventually killed most of these people was in fact hypothermia, it's just there's a number of other factors to be considered here. And that is part of the reason why so many alternatives to the avalanche theory exist. Obviously, I can't list all of them here, but I picked a few to go through because some of them I really like. But the ones I really like still have some issues. One of the most popular theories is that all of this was caused by katabatic winds. Katabatic winds occur when air moves over the top of a mountain and then rapidly descends a slope. This can reach speeds of 80 meters per second, and back in 1978, a group of hikers in Sweden were killed by katabatic winds moving at only 20 meters per second. In this scenario, the Dyatlov group would have noticed what was going on, left the tent, covered it in snow to weigh it down and lower the profile, and gone down the mountain to wait out the gusts. This does explain why they left, why the tent was still intact for the most part, and it also explains how they may have become disoriented and gone the wrong direction. High winds would of course be blowing snow everywhere, it would become easy to be confused and lost, and you could just end up walking the wrong way. But what it doesn't explain is why they took so little with them. If it was just wind, and I know that these are very speedy winds, but if we're not talking about thousands of pounds of snow barreling down on you, we're just talking about gusts of wind that you recognize are dangerous, you probably have a little bit more time to at the very least throw on a parka. Another suggestion was that they had panic induced by infrasound. Infrasound is defined as any sound beneath 20 hertz, and it has been known to cause nausea, disorientation, fear, and anxiety in certain situations. If you're curious about whether or not this works, you can simply ask the Taliban. Now, this would explain why they had to leave the tent. It explains why they left the tent so rapidly, and it explains why they would have attempted to return. Once they realized what was going on, that they weren't in any immediate danger, it was just a weird vibe, they could go back to the tent. The problem is that the evidence suggests they did not panic as they left the tent. They walked in an orderly single-file line down the hill. A bunch of people panicking would probably not walk in a straight line. And then of course there's the idea that maybe the stove fell on top of them, which is one of the most practical reasons that a whole bunch of people would file out of the tent really quickly. It explains that, it explains the lack of clothes, and it even explains some of the group's injuries. However, if there were a fire, the tent would likely have burned and there would be nothing left in it. There were also no burn marks on the tent, and it doesn't explain how they got disoriented and headed down the mountain going the wrong direction. Next up is the cedar issue and the first deaths. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko were the first to die, and it's allegedly because they were the ones looking for firewood and they became exhausted. I think that doesn't make much sense because everyone would have been involved either in getting wood or doing something productive or treating somebody who was injured. So once again, we have to look at the other theories. Some people suggest that there was a lightning bolt that struck the tree while Krivonishenko and Doroshenko were on it, which knocked them off of the tree and eventually caused them to die. The problem is that electrocution was just not even remotely considered during the autopsy because there was simply no evidence of it. They had none of the burn marks that would be consistent with electrocution. Also, the cedar tree would have itself probably been burned. I would wager that they climbed up that tree to get a view of where the tent was, which again is also anti-avalanche because it would suggest that they were trying to get back to the tent as soon as possible and that it wasn't expected that the tent would be covered in snow. And then they eventually fell out of the tree for some reason or another. Maybe they just grabbed onto some ice and slipped, and they just passed away because they were in a lot of pain and simply gave in to exhaustion. And then there's the unexplained split in the group. Kuryakov gives no explanation for why the group split up, just says that they did, and as we've established, there's really two essential possibilities. The group may have agreed that the tent was probably intact, probably contained useful materials, and that they would split up, send one group to go retrieve things from the tent, and the other group would get started making a den. This does explain why they split, it tracks pretty well with what we know, and it's a rational choice. Sending the entire group up to the tent was never a good option. Splitting the group wasn't a great option, but it was one of two crappy options with different possible outcomes. It also explains why Kolmogorova and Slobodin kept going even after Dyatlov died. They weren't doing this for themselves, they were doing it for the entire group. Perhaps only one of them actually needed to make it to the tent. It doesn't explain, however, why Thibaut and Zolotaryov, the two best dressed of the group, were not amongst those who agreed to go up. It's also odd that, considering that once they were in the den, it seemed that they didn't need to be wearing all of the clothing they had, since they were able to make cushions out of some of it, and some of it was discarded in the area. They probably could have given clothes to the other group, and yet they chose not to if this was the case, that they did make an agreement that half the group was going to go for the tent. The other possibility is that the group disagreed on going to the tent and split in two. This would explain why they separated, as well as why Kolmogorova and Slobodin continued on to the tent after Dyatlov died. They simply might have felt that they were unwelcome back at the den, and this was their only option going forward. Maybe they would be welcomed back if they brought back supplies. And it would also explain why gear wasn't shared. If they were angry at each other and Zolotaryov and Thibaut said this is a stupid idea, you shouldn't be doing it, they might not be willing to share gear. However, this was an experienced and professional group, and they likely would have known and understood that their best chances were if they worked together. So splitting up like that seems like a really good way to make sure everyone doesn't make it. On top of that, they were in very good spirits on the night of the 1st, even creating a satirical combat leaflet like they were at the front. It talks about things like philosophical lectures on love and the Yeti being in the area. That's actually where the Yeti theory seems to have come from, is that they made a joke about the Yeti being there. So, you know how it goes. There's a record for assembling a stove. It's just very clear that they're trying to keep themselves in good spirits. And then finally, there's the deaths at the den. Kuryakov chalks it up to a simple fall, but I don't think that that quite does it justice. The elevation difference between the den and where their bodies were found, as I said, was only 0.5 meters to a meter, so 1.5 to 3 feet or so. On top of that, the spot where their bodies were found is 6 meters away. So Kuryakov's explanation that the den collapsed and they fell really doesn't make sense. It doesn't work because the den couldn't collapse half a meter downward and kill them the way it did. It also couldn't collapse half a meter downward and deposit them 6 meters, which again, about 3 feet to a meter, so we're talking about a little over 18 feet here, almost 20 feet. They weren't gonna slide that far away, because if you look at the position of their bodies, and I can't show you the position of their bodies, I can maybe draw you a diagram, but I can't show the actual bodies on YouTube, obviously. But if you look at it, it really does look like they were deposited there. Either they fell there, or somebody placed them there. They certainly did not fall out of the den onto where they were found. And there's more problems other than just the fact that that's not enough distance to kill somebody. Why were they all standing outside of the den at the same time? Why were they all standing so close together? And how did they manage to fall hard enough in just a meter to destroy their own chests and skulls? And if that's what happened, if all of that was caused by a fall, how is it that Kolevatov ended up dying of hypothermia with no major injuries? Now, you might be sitting here going, all right, Aiden, give it to us. Tell us the real unexpected answer here. I'm not going to, because I don't have one. It's not just that what I thought was going to be a 20 or 30 minute video turned into 2 weeks worth of content. It's that there is so much information here that I would have to spend more weeks, like several more weeks, digging through every single piece of information out there on this topic, all of the documentation from the investigation, for me to even come close to being able to present you an account of everything that happened. There's other weird things going on here. Photographs that suggest that maybe things weren't as rosy as they seemed. Differences in the accounting of how many cameras were present. Yuri Yudin, the survivor, his testimony changing over the years in a few different ways. Testimony from the searchers that suggests that, you know what, it really seemed like the Russian government was just trying to say case closed here. We've got a lot of different stuff out there that I just wasn't going to be able to cover in a video that was purely trying to tell you all of the major information and the way the details connected. What I can say is I'm pretty confident that an avalanche did not account for all of these deaths. I don't think an avalanche is the best explanation for why they left the tent. An avalanche does not explain why they went back. There are just far too many issues with the avalanche theory. Personally, I actually do like the katabatic wind theory a lot more, even though I'm still not convinced, obviously, as I said in the video. But if I were to take a stab at explaining what happened here. I still don't have a solid answer for why they left the tent. All I know is that whatever caused them to leave the tent, it seems that either Zolotaryov and Thibault had advanced notice of it, or that for some reason the two of them were both fully dressed, and everybody else was only wearing what they were going to wear to sleep. Whatever caused them to leave the tent, I don't think that they had time to do anything other than maybe pull on the nearest pair of socks and whatever jacket was right next to them in case they needed to pee. I think that they probably left that tent with the intention of going to their storage shed, and instead got disoriented, sidetracked, something was in their way. Again, not enough information to say what that could have been, and they went down to the cedar. Now, one of the problems here is that Zolotaryov's body was found with a camera on it, and nobody's really sure why Zolotaryov would have been holding a camera for no particular reason, also fully dressed, while everybody else except the guy on watch was inside the tent. There are a number of possibilities, a number of theories there that I can't get into in this video, but when we re-release this as a unified single-part video, good news! It's gonna have this additional stuff in it, so you will get new content. It won't just be this and part 1 pasted together. There will be additional stuff that we follow up on later on. So, fun little teaser for what you're gonna get sometime later this year. When they did make their way down to the cedar, I think that they realized they were in the wrong place and decided they needed to find the tent, hence why they climbed the tree. I think because Doroshenko and Krivonishenko climbed so high in that tree, and it was so cold and nobody had gloves, they simply lost their grip and fell out of the tree, at which point they were in so much pain from being bruised in so many places all over their bodies that they simply just gave in. I think that it was probably Dyatlov and Zolotaryov who decided to split up the group, with Dyatlov saying, I'm in charge of the expedition, putting the tent up there was my job, I'm gonna be the one that goes for it. I think because he and Kolmogorova were such good friends, she decided to accompany him. I don't necessarily have an idea why Slobodin went. It might have just been that he said, yeah, I'll go. I think Zolotaryov was the one who suggested building a den because he had the military experience and this would be something that they were taught in basic training. What I can't explain about this section of the issue is the injuries to Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova. I don't understand why they all have bruised knuckles. It really does seem like there was a fist fight, but I can't place where the fist fight would be or how it works into this. Because if it were a fist fight with the group that went to the den, then you would expect that those people would also have bruised knuckles and bruises all over their faces and torsos. But instead they don't, which is very weird to me. I still can't wrap my head around the bruised knuckles. I also don't totally understand why it looks like Slobodin was running when he died and why it looks like Dyatlov was trying to rip open a shirt, which if you look at the position of his hands, they're not wrapped around a shirt, they're just like this over his chest. So I don't totally understand what that is either. I don't have a good answer for it. Maybe I will when we get to the unified version of the video. And I'm still puzzled by Slobodin's injury. I wonder when he got it. As for the den group, that's another weird one to me. And this is why I wonder about the possibility of something being covered up here, whether we're talking about an attack by natives that the Russian government wanted to cover up so that they didn't have to deal with some ethnic conflict, or whether we're talking about somebody in the group going nuts, or we're talking about Bigfoot. I don't particularly know, but there are some injuries here that really can't be explained, like that fracture to Slobodin's head, like the level of crushed ribs on Dubinina and Zolotaryov. And when we look at the den, it doesn't make sense that the spot those people were found was so far away from the den they built. Why did they leave it? What was the point of that? Did something drive them from it? Was it collapsing? You know, how did that end up happening? And how, if you, again, looking at this, the snowy landscape would have had to be so much different that I mean, the current landscape, when you look at the photos, it is not possible that they died the way it was suggested in that spot. There just was not enough room for them to fall. We're talking, again, about 0.5 meters to a meter of elevation difference. So, like I said, when it comes to the Dyatlov Pass incident, it drives me insane that there's so many people out there saying it's been solved, it's been explained, it was just an avalanche. But at the same time, it drives me nuts when people think there's a neat little explanation like a Yeti or UFOs or a missile test, because there's simply far too much going on here for it to just be any of those things. Although the coroner did say that the injuries to Dubinina and Zolotaryov were in fact consistent with the shockwave from a bomb. But again, More on that later. Little hint at part 3. There's just no explanation, be it natural, supernatural, human-caused, complete accident, that neatly wraps everything up with a bow. And that's why I think Dyatlov Pass is such an interesting mystery, and something that we can still revisit every few years, that people can still talk about, take a new angle at, take a new look at it. Because the fact of the matter is, I'm sure there was stuff in here that I saw that other people didn't. I'm sure there are things that other people see that I don't. And the more we talk about it, the more we compare notes, the closer we get to coming up with an actual final explanation for what is honestly one of the 20th century's most interesting mysteries. Anyway, I hope you're not disappointed that I don't have an answer for you on this one, but we will continue investigating, and if I ever get the chance, I would love to go take a look at the place myself, if only to see where all this went down. That said, if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe on Patreon for just $1 a month, or become a member here on YouTube. You can buy our merch at thelorelodge.shop. We got some new t-shirt designs dropping soon that I'm excited about. You can check out our live show Sunday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern here on the Lore Lodge channel, or you can check out our other sister channels, which are The History Hut, The Weird Bible, and Deeper Lore. We stay awake here at the Lodge drinking Mount Pocono Perk by Tavolo Roasting Company, our own signature coffee that I designed myself after working for many years as a barista at an artisan roastery. I can promise you it will legitimately be some of the best coffee you ever had. You can also get updates on what this channel is up to on our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge, or you can hit the link in the description. And if you want to catch me being silly and goofy with some video games and joining community game night and things like that, you can check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/theAidenMattis. Once again, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.